Today's topic is bail reform and its correlation to violent crime. Is it going up? Is it going down? Does it not affect it at all? And joining me today is Ken Good, who is a bail attorney out of Texas. Welcome, Ken.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to talking to about these issues with you.
Well, I am looking forward to talking to you as well because you're the expert. Bail reform is a very fuzzy topic for a lot of people, including me. And I feel like I probably know a little bit more than the average person, but I still don't know half of what I probably could know, right? So I want to start with a story out of New York and a study out of New York, actually, which involves bail reform, politics, and then the real story. Okay. So bail
Sure.
reform, dropped in January of 2020 in New York. And I
Yes,
know,
ma'am.
and I'll start off by saying I know that bail reform laws are different state to state, county to county, and given the population, big or small, it can affect a lot of different things. But I want to start with New York City, and then I want to get into the state of New York. So in 2020, a lot of politicians were touting how successful bail reform was, saying that, only 1% of people who were released on bail reform laws or under bail reform laws were only 1% was rearrested, within the 2 years
Sure.
following their release. And this year, a study came out prepared by John Jay College saying, and this was not even about New York City, it was actually the suburbs of New York and upstate New York, that it was 66% of the people arrested under bail reform laws were actually rearrested within the 2 years of their release. Okay. I personally, when I hear when I hear bail reform, my brain automatically goes to no cash bail.
Well, I would say there is a segment of bail reform that when we talk about that I call bad bail reform. That's what it's intended to do. I mean, the whole concept of the people pushing for these reforms said, well, we need to change the way we do bail because it's going to be declared unconstitutional. The problem is we've now had two circuit courts address it, and they both have held the current private surety bail system constitutional. So then they switched over to, well, it's a fairness issue, so we need to talk about fairness. And so I think that most of the reforms that we would talk about, like what's going on in New York, we would say that those are pushes for no cash bail. And that's exactly what it was in New York. So in New York, they passed a statute that said, here's all these charges, mostly misdemeanor, but all these charges where the judge's hands are tied and they can no longer grant a bail bond, a private surety bond. And in New York, they specifically call it, they're released on no bond. I call that simple release. So they're just released on their own promise to come back to court. California would call it release on zero bail. Texas would call it release on a personal bond. But they're all simple release mechanisms where they're just promising to come back. The problem is recidivism, when you have no accountability and they quit coming to court and their cases are put on hold, but it's still the same type of charge. So they can't be, when they come back, they have to be released simply again. People see that as a green light to commit more crime. The problem is we're seeing politics being played with these recidivism numbers. So the people who supported the changes or who advocated for them, they're the ones that are doing fuzzy math, and they're saying they're using these statistics that we've never used before for determining recidivism. So they'll take, well, here's the people that were arrested, but here's the whole spectrum of everybody that was ever arrested on crime in that same time period. That's not how you calculate recidivism. So I did a podcast with Jim Quinn, who's a former assistant DA and from New York, and he goes in depth about talking about the fuzzy math on the recidivism. We're seeing that in other places too. We're seeing it in Houston, Harris County. We're seeing it in California, where they just can't acknowledge that the recidivism rate is going up. And 61% is probably the number that Jim Quinn talks about as well. Because if they were to do that, the public would never support these changes. So they have to deny that there's recidivism going up. They have to deny that their changes are causing crime to increase just to get the public to continue to support them. When this ends, when this blows up in their face, it's going to have a terrible backlash like we've had in the 60s when we tried this all again and we just seem to be repeating the same cycle.
Well, okay. So what would be the benefit to having a simple release or a no cash bail? I mean, what is? I know that the thresholds they try to use is misdemeanors or low level felonies, right? And I mean, what is a low level
Yeah.
felony
Well, what
necessarily?
they keep changing felonies and reclassifying them to misdemeanors too. That's another way they keep saying crime is going down. But the problem is when you start doing these things and misdemeanors and politics starts going in, then you see like what's happening in Harris County. They start using more of these simple release mechanisms for felony court as well. I mean, we've had situations where people arrested for murder were getting released on a personal one and were not being held, which historically they would be, until they commit a second murder. And so I started saying that in, Houston and Harris County, you get one free murder before they're going to hold you. Like a dog, you get one free bite. And
But
so
how is that? I mean, how would murder be classified? I mean,
it's
is it?
not it's not it's not being classified as nonviolent. It's just that the politics is overcoming this. There was a Chief Bruger, who is a police officer from around Houston in the Pasadena area. He had someone released on a personal bond come out and commit another violent offense. So he went to court, say, why are you releasing this person again on a personal bond? And the judge just said, my party wants me to release more people on simple release personal bonds. That's what we call it in Texas. And so I'm doing what my party wants. So public safety be damned. It's the politics that's causing this.
Let's break it down. So as far as like say I steal a car, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And I get arrested, and I'm in the state of New Jersey, let's say, and
Mm-hmm.
which is obviously a very liberal blue state. Okay, now I go to court. Who determines whether or not I get released with? Is it the judge? Is it up to the discretion of the judge? No priors, just this one car theft. Do I get arrested and then released on no bond or a small bond, or what's happening there?
New Jersey enacted what we call the New Jersey Plan, where they were one of the first states to enact bail reform. They enacted it in a way that was very expensive. They had to do a tax increase to pay for it. They did it in such a way that no other state has followed that since, even though they were one of the first. But the way that they decreased their jail population was by doing a lot of cite and release. So instead of taking you to jail, you just get a ticket showing you when you need to go to court. That has a high failure to appear rate. So in the example you've given for theft, that's not considered a violent offense. It's just theft. I mean, it has substantial consequences to the society and to public safety, but we don't classify it a violent offense. So it would be one of those where you can't be held. When you do a charge-based release, statutes that say these charges, the trial court must do X. We're tying the hands of the judges so they have no discretion. Doesn't matter if you have a lengthy criminal history. Doesn't matter if you've been arrested however many times. You will only get a simple release mechanism, and it's because of the state laws tying the hands of the judges.
Okay, so let's just say I commit a violent crime. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
but in my county, jail's full. Now what happens?
It depends on where you are. So if you commit a violent offense, like here in Texas, then you're going to go before a magistrate. They have to look at your criminal history. They have to look at the offense. They have to look at your ability to pay, but it does not trump anything. It's only one of the things that they look at. If you've got a substantial criminal history, they're going to set a pretty high bond, and you're not going to be eligible for simple release. In California, New York, New York has, since they enacted their bail reform, they have now had 3 or 4 rollbacks where they've limited its application. So they've given the judges more discretion, and so they've loosened the knots on their hands for some offenses. But the problem is, when the jail's full, I think there's a lot of pressure on the judges to work with the county. But like Houston right now, I mean, if you've got a long criminal history and you've got a violent offense, you're going to have a high bond. And in New York, it would be you would have a bond, but I still think that they would release you on something that you said you could afford, because the politics right now is, well, if I say I can't afford this bond, then they're going to set it lower. The courts have rejected that argument, and they've said all you have is a right to a hearing. So did you consider all the things about whether they have the ability to pay versus all the other elements? And if you considered them, then they don't have a right to release. But that's part of the political fight is, if I say I can't afford this bond, then you have to set it at an amount I can afford because I have a right to release. That's been rejected by the courts, but it hasn't been, it can't overcome the politics.
Okay, so specifically though, there's this argument that, if that bail reform has increased violent crimes, and then there's opponents to this saying no, it hasn't. But it's confusing because bail reform is supposed to be, like we said, for misdemeanors and for low-level felonies. So if these people are rearrested for a misdemeanor and then released, right, and then rearrested, how does it lead to violent crime since their first or second crime is not a violent crime?
When your release mechanism has a failure to appear rate. So in criminal cases, if you don't show up for court, your case gets put on hold until you return back. The release mechanism that has the lowest failure to appear rate by far is the private sector. Everything else pales in comparison. Like simple release has a 50 to 80% failure to appear rate. And just imagine if 50% of the time people are not coming to court, their cases are being put on hold. And, like in California, it's an 80% failure to appear rate across the state on misdemeanor cases. In Harris County, in Houston, where they're doing something similar on misdemeanor cases, there's a Harris County Court Watch that says it's also an 80% failure to appear rate. Well, what does an 80% failure to appear rate do? Your cases get put on hold. In California, you have a time limit to resolve the misdemeanor case or it's dismissed. And so they have a high dismissal rate. Same thing in Houston, high dismissal rate. That's perceived as a green light to commit more crime because, hey, they can't resolve the cases.
But this was specifically regarding violent crime. Like that's
but everything bleeds over from misdemeanors and bleeds over to felonies. So today's misdemeanors are tomorrow's felonies. We've got a backlog of cases from COVID when we weren't trying cases. So the jails are already full of very dangerous people. And so how do we hold anybody accountable for failing to show up on a misdemeanor case? We don't. And so those become, okay, we can commit more crime. People get more brazen, so they commit more violent crime.
I got you.
And, there's a study out of Yolo County, California, where they kept the data from COVID and said someone released on simple release for a nonviolent offense has a 200% greater chance of committing a violent offense in the next 18 months over somebody released on a private surety bond. I mean, those are devastating numbers. And if this is from a DA who's not a Republican or a Democrat. He's, not partisan. And when you look at that data, you go like, why would we release anybody on simple release? Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what some people are starting to ask.
Right. Well, and I also feel like when people talk about something like bail reform, I think a lot of the average person who isn't connected to law enforcement or isn't, connected to the criminal justice system at all, they kind of hit the snooze button because it doesn't really feel like it relates to them, right? But it is a huge part of politics and who we vote for and will affect how how this will go. And then eventually, I guess, if you're touched by the crime, that's when you start to pay attention, right? So I just don't understand who actually benefits other than the criminals themselves from, like, in terms of politicians and
I've got a great response to that. And for the last however many election cycles, 6 months before an election, we have one party that would churn up a mob. So we would have some travesty take place with a minority, and we would have all these protests. It was like clockwork 6 months before an election, and it would whip up, certain minority groups to say, you're being taken advantage of by the criminal justice system, and you need to come out in larger numbers and vote for us. And that resulted in a mob. And it just was political rhetoric for years. And then they started electing the true believers that, hey, this is what's really going on in the criminal justice system. And you're being taken advantage of. You need to elect me and we'll soften all these procedures. And you know what? It's worked. The problem is the whole fallacy of this argument is if we're not going to have public safety, who does it hurt the worst? The very communities that they say they're trying to help is the communities that are being hurt, because we, by and large, commit crime on our same demographics. So, 50% of all murder victims in the United States are young black males, and the people who are committing those crimes are, by and large, young black males. And somewhere in this debate, we've decided to choose and favor the young black male murderer over the young black male victim or his family, because he's gone. And it's all because we decided many election cycles that every 6 months we're going to create a mob out of anger. And now this is where we are. We're losing control of the mob. That's why you're seeing all these protests, because once you create a mob, you can't control it. And now they're bowing their knees to the mob just to try to keep in political power just a couple more election cycles before it blows up.
Speaking of mobs, the smash and grabbers, right? This has been an ongoing thing since COVID, really. I feel like we've seen
we've really seen it in New York, California, where they've created this decriminalization of theft under $950. That's when it took off in our urban areas.
It is related to the bail reform, right? It's directly.
Absolutely. Well, you got Prop 47 in California, where they took certain felonies and changed them to misdemeanors on the argument this will help people be able to find jobs. But then in our urban areas, because they'll still have to answer for.
I'm sorry.
Well, they'll still have to answer for the crime, but they won't have a felony on their record, so they'll be able to get hired.
Wow.
The problem is then in our urban areas, our prosecutors, our progressive prosecutors said we're no longer going to prosecute theft under $950. And so that's one of the ways they're saying crime's going down, because that's no longer a crime in their area. But when you have businesses closing because they can't withstand $25,000 a day of shoplifting, commercial properties are diving in value. Selling for 30%, 50% of their value in San Francisco from just a couple of years ago. This is absolutely the cause of when crime is going up. We've given up on crime in California, and it's not sustainable. There's a petition drive that's on the ballot in November to repeal Prop 47. The legislature tried to create something to smoke and mirrors the public, but the backlash was so bad that they dropped it. And so I expect Prop 47 to be repealed in November. I also expect, the DA in LA County not to be rearrested, because he's one of the big progressives. And it'll be interesting to see what happens, because, part of the problem in California is they don't have enough capacity in their prison system. They've been capped at 137.4% of capacity, and they're not willing to build more. So everything they're doing there is to decrease their prison population. And they keep saying, well, it will make us safer. No, it is doing exactly what you would think it would do. It's causing more crime, but they're trying to decrease their prison population, and it's just barely under. And we have all this crime that's going on. They need to build more capacity. And until they do that, it's going to be a continued problem in California.
Okay, so like I said at the beginning, it varies from state to state, county to county. In your opinion, what would be a reasonable blanket solution to what we're dealing with nationwide when it comes to bail reform? How do you get the message across, number one, that this is a major problem, and what would be a happy medium if there even is one?
Well, okay, so I want to make 3 points, and I'll say there's a case that it shows us the way on how to get control. I would use the Texas bail reform model, which is good bail reform. And then, the third point I would make is is there a happy compromise? So the first point is there is a case that shows us the way about how to go forward. It's called Sanchez versus Alabama. It was a case where they lived under one of these preliminary injunctions, require them to release everybody for about 4 years. No accountability. Crime started increasing, but they won their appeal. They won. And so I did a podcast with the sheriff, and he said, we re-implemented procedures for holding people accountable. And if they didn't show up for court, there were consequences. He said it took about 6 months, but the mindset of people began to change, and crime started going down. Mm-hmm. And so we do have the model. We know what to do. We just need the politicians to untie the hands of the judges and allow law enforcement to do their job. And we need to do kind of like what Texas has done, limit the use of simple release mechanisms, especially for violent offenses, because it has such a high failure to appear rate. It creates chaos. It puts pressure on the courts for de facto decriminalization. And so we need to strengthen the criminal justice system. We need to require judges to review criminal histories instead of doing charge-based release. So no matter how many times you're charged with theft, you get the same treatment. Everybody needs to be treated based on their criminal history. And then the third point I would make is there compromise? I question whether there is compromise on this issue, because the people who are arguing for the reforms are just out and out lying. I mean, there's one group of attorneys that have filed suits all over the country, and they recently lost for the umpteenth time at the Supreme Court. And their quote in the local paper was, "Every trial court that has ever looked at this issue has ruled in our favor that it's unconstitutional." Well, what they failed to point out, and I had to write a letter to the editor, was that every appeal of those cases has been reversed. So they've lost every argument at the appellate level, and they never acknowledge that they've lost. They just keep bringing new suits, making the same argument, and they were winning the trial court, then losing the Court of Appeals. They're not filing suits anymore because they've lost so many times. I think they would be sanctioned if they brought a new one. But they keep making the same arguments. They keep saying, "Well, every trial court's ruled in our favor. Every court of appeals has reversed that."
That's wild. I mean, and now you're saying that the very communities that this is supposed to benefit, it actually is a detriment to the community, because the offenses are then repeated in those same communities, right? And so we're talking mainly about the minorities. But what about crimes like domestic crimes? I mean, what is the effect there?
Oh, it's absolutely devastating, because before all this bail reform, the domestic violence group of our society really had very little faith in the legal, the criminal justice system, because, we had a high dismissal rate on domestic violence cases. They're looked at skeptically sometimes. Sometimes, especially if there's divorce, there's this assumption that it's someone trying to get a leg up in the divorce. And also, people, the victim, the person who committed, will go to them and say, "I'm so sorry, will you please give me another chance?" And so they won't be a witness, and so the case will have to be dropped. After bail reform, or in these areas where they've done this bad bail reform, I mean, there's not any faith in the criminal justice system. And, the police officers that are trying to help them will say, "Run." So they have to get their escape plan in place. They have to get their support system in place, and they have to forget about the criminal justice system. That's almost an afterthought. They have to get all that in place before they can even approach the criminal justice system, because we have cases like Caitlin Guajardo in Houston, where her husband was already on a simple release mechanism for hit and run on a car, leaving the scene of an accident. And then he got arrested for just domestic violence and got another personal bond anyway, got out within hours, killed her, stabbed her 30-something times in the stomach because she was pregnant.
Oh, God.
And he told the officer, "I didn't want another man raising my child."
Okay. Oh my God, that's like, I mean, these cases I can't even. And I mean, so it's already so difficult for women in those situations, right? Because they're scared to begin with, right? And now they're what you just said is basically saying, "Hey, on your own, even though you haven't done it yet on your own, make sure you get all your ducks in a row before you bring in the criminal justice system," when really their first response is to bring in the criminal justice system, because they're not armed with the tools to do all the things that they're being told to do. That is a disaster.
Well, and before all this, if they involve the criminal justice system, they would get a protective order. Right. And, but when the criminal justice system can't do anything to them until they violate the protective order. Right. And so they would violate it. And sometimes they violate it by murder, but other times they do it in a less than murder rate. And the criminal justice system would step in. But now, with all this bad bail reform in those areas, I mean, the criminal justice system almost has its hands tied, because we look at domestic violence in most situations as a misdemeanor. And so if you're violating a protective order on a misdemeanor, even in Texas, you can hold them without bail under the Texas Constitution, but no judge in these urban areas is going to do that because it's a misdemeanor. We're by and large going to release you on a simple release mechanism because it's a misdemeanor. And that's the whole bad thing about the bad bail reform.
Okay, so you say it's a misdemeanor. Now, I'm gonna kind of get a little more detailed. So let's just say the domestic crime was violent in that the woman gets beat up, right? So take domestic crime out of it. Now let's have a guy beat up a guy on the street. Is it treated the same way as a misdemeanor?
Well, I think a lot of assault starts out a misdemeanor. So I
Mm,
think that, that's one of the problems that we're having in our urban areas. We're downgrading a lot of felonies to misdemeanors. And that's one of the ways they're saying crime is going down
right.
when it's really just a reclassification. I mean, the politics are so bad right now. Look at the national level. We've got one candidate for president saying crime is not going up and that we're safe, and that's just a perception issue. And that's been the talking point of that party for the last 2 election cycles. It's worked. It will continue to work till it blows up in their face, and there'll be a huge backlash, just like we've had this cycle happen before. I don't think that that's going to work this time because the NAACP in Oakland has issued a letter to the local officials saying they need a state of emergency on crime. And the local DA came out, said exactly what you think. Oh, so sad that the NAACP is using Republican talking points. And the regional NAACP came in and defended the local chapter, saying, no, we've got a crime problem. And so now they're doing a petition drive to recall that progressive DA in Oakland. And so I think the pressure is really is switching. And so you can see the pendulum starting to change, like in New York, where they've rolled back their reform several times. And you can see Prop 47 being repealed in California. The problem we have is, how do we change the mindset? Well, we have to have accountability. We have to hold people accountable. We have to show them that we're willing to do that. California cannot do that with their current capacity on their prison system. And so until they change that, their hands are going to continue to be tied.
Mm. Which was one of my initial questions, was about just, the capacity of the prisons to hold the people. And it almost feels like there isn't a solution.
Okay, well, let's say it a different way. At any given time, when you have an urban area, you have a big city of people, but you have this small group that is committing most of the crime. It's like a city within a city. But around the two groups, there's this little gray area. And it's a large group of people who are any given day deciding, am I going to live in the law-abiding part of the city, or am I going to live in the lawbreaker part of the city? And they're basing their decision on, what is the criminal justice system doing? And if the criminal justice system is holding people accountable and making it like it's not a good idea to break the law, then they're going to follow the law and order city. We just have in our progressive areas right now, in our urban areas, we're sending the message that we're going to let you do what you want. I mean, I make this argument, and it just seems over the top. But what would these progressive DAs be doing if they were different? If they were in the pockets of organized crime, gangs, and professional criminals? What would they be doing different if they were in their pockets than what they're doing now? I can't think of anything they would be doing different.
No, you're not wrong. It's it's weird. It's like it's the criminal justice system has become almost criminalized in a way, because they really are being influenced by politics and not law and order, right? I mean, that's really what it comes down to in the end.
Mm-hmm. Well, and this is how bad it's gotten. I mean, I haven't even released this podcast yet, but my last podcast I did was with a journalist who wrote an article talking about how in California they legalized marijuana, but the legalized market has failed and it's been taken over by cartels. And so they're bringing their business to the United States and setting it up in low population areas like our national parks that can't have any construction. And so they're moving in, taking over where there's low law enforcement. And I mean, they're not laundering their money in the United States. They're bringing their industry to the United States. And our open borders has made it easy for them to bring their employees to the United States. They fly them into Mexico and they come across the border claiming they want sanctuary, and then they start reporting to work. And we have decriminalized marijuana, so there's no real penalty for them if they get arrested. And in these urban areas, one of the things that these DAs do is they no longer file increases for the amount of drugs that are they are caught with. So if they're charged with drug possession, it's no more than a week or 2 weeks instead of 20 years, because we're no longer doing any enhancements on the amount of drugs they're found with. And so it's very profitable for them to do that. And we're seeing this in any state where they're decriminalizing marijuana. And, you know, you're like, why aren't we hearing this in the news? Well, it's being covered, but it's being covered in the middle of the section on the back page. It's not being covered on the front page because it doesn't fit the political narrative.
Of course. And they're also downplaying it a lot too, right?
Sure. That's what the narrative is, but it's starting to change. You can see in the presidential candidate for one party saying, I'm going to be tough on the border. I haven't been tough on the border for 3 years. I'd even deny that I was the border czar, even though I was called the border czar. But I promise you, if I get elected, I haven't done it for 3 years, but I will start to be really tough on the border. And, that's kind of like a wink, wink, nod, nod to her party going, yeah, I'll be tough on the border. Nothing will change. But the politics are such now that it's so toxic for one party. They have to at least say they're going to be tough on the border, even when they're not.
I think people are so focused on the social issues like abortion, and I think that's about it these days, right? It's abortion. That's all they really seem to talk about anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the border. Mm-hmm. But, I just think that the criminal justice system, and, it's so, I don't know how you feel about this, but, when Donald Trump was on trial, right, for the 34 felonies, the bad checks and whatever, everyone was paying attention to that and calling him a criminal. But no one was paying attention to the fact that he was on trial when it was classified as a Class E felony, and no one else would have been on trial, right? Whether you like him or not, it doesn't matter. Our criminal justice system should not be politicized. And that's all you see anymore.
Well, remember Bragg, one of the progressive DAs, initially declined to pursue charges against Trump. Only after politics got involved did he change his mind. And then who did he bring in? Somebody that used to work at the DOJ that's all they're doing is prosecuting Trump. The sentencing is set for early September. You could take a step back. Let's just look at the timeline. So he was found guilty. The very next week, they had their debate between Biden and Trump. You could argue that their strategy was very simple. Have him be convicted of 34 misdemeanor felonies. That's what they are, felonies, but only because the misdemeanors are coupled with another crime that they failed to identify. And then they said it could be 3 different crimes. And the judge said they didn't have to be unanimous on which crime they thought it was. And that's never going to stand up on appeal, but that wasn't the purpose. The purpose was to get this conviction. And so they could go to the debate and call him a convicted felon, have all the Republicans abandon him, and then it not matter what Biden's mental state was. He was going to be the only sense of normalcy. Well, that didn't happen. And so suddenly, what are we going to do? And so they had to get rid of Biden. And now they're coalescing. They didn't want
her,
their current nominee, but that would have split their party if they didn't keep her. So now you have this honeymoon period where she's not had one press conference. She's not answered any difficult questions. She's just completely scripted. It's kind of like the Obama theory all over again. We're having a coronation and she didn't even get one vote in the primaries. That will continue for another week until after the DNC, and then things will start getting real, and we'll see. I've told my friends, just ignore the polls until after the DNC, because I think the DNC is going to be really ugly. There's going to be lots of protests because there's a lot bigger split in the Democrat side than people are realizing, or the press will even report, because they would rather lie than have Trump. I mean, that's just the reality. And I don't know why that is, but I think my argument at this point is if they're willing to do it to Trump, they'll do it to any
You
Republican.
know what? I think it's really interesting, though, that you said that when they had the debate, it was going to make Trump look like a felon and make Biden look like he sounded like a normal person. I actually had a completely different take on that. I actually thought that we had this unprecedented timing of a debate, scheduled because the Democratic Party didn't have any other way of displaying the state that Biden was in, right? I don't think that they were. I think that it was more purposeful on their part because it was like, how else were they going to expose this? And I think that's why we had the debate in June. That was my take.
I think that is a very valid theory, and I won't say that I don't believe that, because I think that is absolutely possible. But I think Biden's team's plan the whole time was to get Trump convicted, call him a felon at this debate, and then have him disqualified, quote unquote disqualified from being president, and then it wouldn't matter what he is and that what was going on with Biden, because he would be the only source of stability. So I think this is probably. Either theory's true. I mean, and they could be both true, that was what the political elites were planning. And then that's the reason why they justified it to Biden, and he agreed to it.
Awesome. This is very uplifting. You know that, right?
Well, but I do have hope, because what we're seeing right now is not sustainable. And so since it's not sustainable, we will have change for the good, because the public will demand public safety. And even though we have, Mayor Adams in New York City, he's a progressive, but he's under attack by the far left because they don't think he's doing enough to allow enough crime going on. But he said, look, public safety is one of the foundations of society. And if we can't provide public safety, then we won't have a society.
Police officer. I mean, it's incredible,
yes.
but, everyone's trying to please their party, right? And for some reason, the 10% on the left have become the voice of all of the Democrats, right?
Right, because you're seeing it in California too. But in New York, the reason why the Republicans control the House right now is because of New York. In New York, crime was such a problem that we had several House seats change from Republican to Democrat. Yeah. And even Nancy Pelosi attacked New York, saying the reason why the House switched parties was your fault. Now, the same thing could even happen in California, where Democrat seats switched to Republican because of crime. I mean, it's not an accident or a coincidence that the governor is announcing that he wants to get rid of homeless, people living on the streets, and he's asking for people to clean out these encampments right now, 4 months before an election. He's doing it because of what's happening in crime.
Oh, 100%. It's just amazing to me, though. Like, it's just amazing to me that, like, politics wins over safety and government.
Oh, yeah. When has that ever happened before?
That's the difference. Someone made a point about this a couple of years ago about how there's government and then there's politics, and they're not the same. They're just not the same.
No. Well, and the point that you made earlier about, abortion, that's really I think that, we've got one party that has taken advantage of that Supreme Court ruling and used that to victory, because that's trumped. I mean, we've got coalitions, but that's a big enough coalition that combined with everything else, it has won. I'm not sure that it wins this time. I mean, we've actually had more abortions committed in this country in the last year than we've ever had before. So it's kind of hard to say that ruling is preventing abortions from taking place. I don't think the Republicans, though, have a strong response to that. And, that's one of the issues that divides the Republican Party, because the, one part of the party is just religion based, and, they're not going to change their position. They're not going to soften their position, because it's part of who they are, and it's part of their walk with God. And so I understand that. But the other party has no problem turning around and attacking them, arresting them, prosecuting them for crimes, and, accusing them of being the problem. I mean, we would have never done that 5 years ago, and we would have never even thought about it 10 years ago. And now it's kind of like we're thinking that's the norm.
It's kind of crazy. But as far as, what you just said about the religious conservatives and stuff, I mean, that's actually a problem when it comes down to the Constitution, because there's supposed to be a separation of church and state, right? So you really can't bring your religion in when it comes to making laws or undoing.
Well, but I think that's almost a talking point from the left because the Constitution says you won't have a state religion. So I mean, I'm Ken Good. I am a religious person, and so you're saying that I can't bring my
Morality.
religious experiences or I can't bring my morality into the governor's office. I don't agree with
Hmm.
that. I think that our our history of our country is that whoever's elected gets to rely upon their personal experiences for what they believe in, but we're trying to use that as almost a disqualification for anybody that's religious. And that's really, I mean, how do you reconcile Nancy Pelosi's a strong Christian, but she believes in abortion? Joe Biden is a strong Catholic. I think they both are, but they support abortion. I think they have had problems where I think Nancy Pelosi, her priest would not give her communion because of her positions on abortion.
It goes both ways, right? Conservatives pro life, and then, but then they're pro death penalty, right?
But okay. I mean, I would almost make a joke there. I've said this before, but I'm kind of, when it comes to the death penalty in Texas, you're not ever going to have a problem with the death penalty or opposition to it. I'm kind of an Old Testament Christian when it comes to the death penalty. It's like an eye for an eye, tooth for a
Right.
tooth. Um, but if I was going to be honest, I would say there's not a conflict with Christianity on that issue, because in Christianity we're taught we're all sinners, we're all bad, we're all sinners except for those who are saved by grace. And so if you think that we're all bad
Hmm.
people or have the potential to be bad people, there are some that are so bad or do something so bad that it merits the ultimate
Punishment. Hmm.
punishment. Um, and I mean, I'm not going to argue that there's any great benefit from it, but I'm just going to say there are bad people in the world, and there are some that are so bad that merits the worst punishment available.
You're right, though. I agree with you. There are no good answers. I think it's a personal choice. I think everybody's journey is different. Everybody's story is different. Belief systems are different, and I think that that's where the choice for me comes down to with everybody. Like, I don't have a problem with a difference of opinion whatsoever. I just think in terms of the freedom of people to believe what they want to believe, and also have the right to live their lives the way they see fit.
But look at how this is overcoming and taking over the presidential election. The Supreme Court has stepped in and ruled on the issue of abortion, saying it's not a federal issue anymore. It's a state issue. So it goes to the states. But you've got one candidate for president saying, I will change the abortion ruling. I will. And so they're wanting to relitigate the issue. And let's just say, okay, if the Supreme Court's correct and they push it back to the states, then that candidate can do nothing about it. And so she's just whipping up um, identity politics is really what we're doing. I mean, we're doubling down on identity politics, because if nothing can be done about it, then what are the issues that she can do something about? Well,
Right.
those are the issues that harm her and she doesn't want to talk about.
Right. You're right. Well, Ken, this is we started with bail reform and we ended on abortion. We've just
Well, but
gone the
abortion is influencing so much of our elections right now. We kind of have to admit that, and I'm hopeful that this will be the election where it doesn't. But I predicted when Kamala would took over for the candidacy that that's all we're going to hear about from now until November is abortion, abortion, abortion. And so
yeah.
far, that's been correct.
Yeah, you're not wrong. You did a great job in explaining bail reform, but I still think it is so, even for me, it's so convoluted that I feel like we don't have enough awareness about the effects of bail reform laws on the system, and then ultimately our personal lives based on that system. And I hope that there are more of you out there who can sort
Yeah.
of be more vocal and get this more mainstream in terms of conversation. I know it's increased, but we're in an election cycle, and more people, people are talking about these issues, but not enough, in my opinion. But
Well, I appreciate it. I think there's been several commentators that said if New York had not passed bail reform, we wouldn't even know the issue, but they passed it. And so that brought it to the light and put it in the spotlight. And I think, and then, me, I set about to become an expert on these issues. And I've written many articles on them because no one was telling the story, the true story. And, you know, if people want more information about me or my organization, you go to pbtx.com. We have our own podcast called The Bell Post. It's on our menu. Or you can just go to thebellpost.com, and we just talk about criminal justice issues like, you know, the New Jersey plan, charitable bail funds, what's going on in New York and California. And so we just criminal justice 24/7.
All right. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a pleasure. And so I'd love to have you back if there's any changes to the laws or anything positive happening instead of all the bad things that are going on.
Thank you very much.